In 1996, a man bought an abandoned chapel in rural Georgia, hoping to turn it into a quiet homestay and leave his past behind. But as he restored the crumbling walls, he stumbled upon something sealed beneath the floor, something that had been hidden for decades. 2 months later, a federal investigation would uncover one of the most disturbing child disappearances cases in the region's history. The chapel was never meant to be reopened. Caleb Dawson hadn't planned to start over in a place so quiet, so far from the thrum of the life he used to know. But sometimes life doesn't ask for plans, it simply unravels them. 2 months after finalizing a bitter divorce and losing his job at a failing tech startup in Atlanta, Caleb found himself driving deep into rural Georgia, where the roads narrowed and the radio signal faded into static. In the back of his truck were his remaining belongings: tools, boxes of books, and a coffee-stained mattress he'd slept on for 3 weeks too long. At the heart of a small town called Hartley Ridge, a property listing had caught his attention online. Historic Chapel, 1871, needs TLC, price to sell. The photos showed an old stone church with ivy clawing up its sides, a crooked cross above the bell tower, and stained glass windows, some intact, some shattered. It looked forgotten, but it had a strange dignity to it. Caleb didn't believe in signs, but something about that image pulled at him. The chapel had once been a community center, then abandoned after a lightning strike damaged part of its foundation in the late 90s. No one wanted it. The roof leaked, the floors creaked, and vines had found their way inside like they were searching for confession. But for Caleb, it was affordable. More than that, it felt blank. And blank was what he needed. A place to wipe the slate clean. When he first stepped through the front door, the sunlight pierced through cracked panes, painting the warped pews with fractured light. His boots echoed on the worn hardwood floor as he moved slowly down the aisle. Despite the quiet, something in the air felt charged. He chalked it up to nerves, or maybe the silence after months of chaos. He told himself it was nothing. That first night, Caleb slept on the floor of the old stateroom with only his toolbox as a pillow and a portable lantern casting shadows against the faded walls. He wasn't afraid, not really, but he did keep his bedroom door shut and latched just in case. The following weeks passed in a blur of sawdust and paint fumes. Caleb threw himself into the renovation, restoring the chapel with equal parts grit and stubbornness. He repaired the roof shingles, replaced shattered glass with salvaged panels from a nearby town, and even managed to sand down and restain the original altar, converting it into a check-in counter for the future homestead. Locals started to notice. An old woman named Mrs. Whitlock brought him pies and stories. A retired handyman named Earl offered tips on insulation. They were kind in a reserved Southern way, curious but cautious. One rainy Tuesday, while Caleb was ripping out old floorboards in what had been the Sunday school room, his crowbar hit something solid beneath the rotted wood. Not concrete, not brick, metal. He pried harder, sweat dripping down his temples despite the cool air. Beneath the floorboards lay a tarnished mirror, its edges rimmed in ornate brass. Behind it, tucked into the exposed wall, he found something else, a folded, yellowing paper brittled with age. On it, a hand-drawn map, simple, crude, lines and curves that seemed to chart the underside of the chapel. Caleb stared at it for minutes before noticing the words written faintly in red ink along the bottom. Do not go deeper. He laughed nervously to himself. Someone had a flair for drama, apparently. He assumed it was some prank from the past or a leftover Halloween gimmick. Still, he couldn't deny the chill that crawled up his arms. That night, he laid the map flat on the dining table, while the plywood slab that would soon become one, and stared at it under the lamp. The path it marked wasn't the foundation. It wasn't plumbing. It was something else. He followed the lines with his fingertip. They all led to a point labeled only Crossroads. Caleb didn't sleep much that night. A storm rolled in around midnight, heavy wind rattling the old glass. The air inside the chapel felt heavier somehow, thicker, like the walls were listening. He chalked it up to paranoia. Too many horror films as a kid, too much dust in his lungs. But the next morning, something changed. As he was drinking his coffee on the front steps, he noticed a shape on the side of the building that hadn't been there before. Faint, like chalk rubbed almost clean. It looked like a symbol, an old one, circular with a triangle at its core. The brick beneath it felt colder than the rest of the wall. Caleb touched it once, then twice. It was real, not a trick of light, not a stain, just another mystery layered onto a place already buried in silence. Caleb had never considered himself superstitious, but after that first stormy night in the chapel, something inside him shifted. The air felt different. The walls felt reactive, like they absorbed his presence, like they waited. He tried to push the thought aside and refocus on the reservation. There were practical matters to attend to, permits to file, plumbing to fix, linens to order. He kept the map tucked inside a drawer, glancing at it occasionally but never letting it pull him in too far. Not yet. Still, it lingered at the back of his mind, like a humming, constant, quiet, insistent. A few days after discovering the strange symbol outside, Caleb returned to the same Sunday school room, intending to replace the warped floorboards with newer planks he'd salvaged from a deconstructed barn outside of town. As he peeled back another layer of wood, the crowbar caught on something different this time. Not metal, not brick, but the faint hiss of shifting air. He paused, his brow furrowing, as he dropped to one knee and pressed his palm to the exposed gap. Cool air pulsed gently upward from the dark slit in the floor. Not natural draft, not from any venting system he had installed. This was something older, forgotten. Carefully he pried up the surrounding boards until the gap widened enough to reveal what lay beneath. A rusted grill, like an old ventilation shaft, its bars bent inward like something, or someone, had once pushed through from the other side. The grill was caked in dust and age, yet beneath it Caleb could make out a void. Not a crawl space, deeper, wider. A descending shaft lined in stone. Heart pounding, he retrieved his flashlight and lowered the beam into the darkness. The light barely penetrated the shaft's depth, but he could make out a staircase, crude and spiraling downward. The air that drifted up was stale, but not dead. There was something living in that cold, damp breath. Caleb sat back on his heels, breathless. He didn't go down, not that day. Instead, he covered the gap with plywood and stacked his tools on top, like a child afraid the monster might climb out if left unchecked. But from that moment on, the shaft beneath the Sunday school room wasn't just part of him. It lived in the back of his thoughts. He started dreaming of narrow staircases and whispers behind stone, the kind of dreams that leave you awake and sweating, unsure if you've just escaped something or missed your chance to understand it. On the fifth night, after discovering the shaft, sleep evaded him completely. The wind had settled, but the chapel creaked in ways that made no architectural sense. Long groans from the beams overhead, thuds from behind the walls, and occasionally a sharp, ticking sound, like fingernails on wood. He chalked it up to settling, old wood breathing, maybe squirrels. Maybe. But then came the footsteps. It was after 2 a.m, and Caleb lay wide-eyed in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, when he heard it. Soft, uneven, slow. Someone was walking, but not above him, not outside. From below. He held his breath and sat upright, the mattress groaning beneath him. The sound came again, faint, deliberate steps, as if pacing. The cadence didn't match anything mechanical. It wasn't plumbing, wasn't wind. It was human. Or at least pretending to be. He slid quietly from bed, grabbed his flashlight, and tiptoed through the main corridor of the chapel. Every creak of the floor felt like a gunshot in the stillness. At the door to the Sunday school room, he paused, hand trembling on the knob. For a second he considered turning back, locking the door, and pretending he'd imagined it all. But the footsteps had stopped. Silence now, so complete it felt suffocating. Caleb stepped into the room. The air was cooler, denser. He moved slowly, approaching the stack of plywood covering the shaft. He crouched, pressed an ear close to the boards, and waited. Nothing. Just the hum of his blood in his ears, and then 3 soft knocks from underneath. Caleb jerked backward, heart slamming into his ribs. The flashlight trembled in his grip as he pointed it toward the ground, though the wood blocked his view. He wanted to run. Every cell in his body screamed at him to run. But he didn't. He stood there, frozen, pulse crashing like a drum, waiting, listening. The knocks didn't come again, no more footsteps, just the wind, finally stirring outside, brushing against the stained glass panes like fingers. The next morning, the world felt off-kilter. Caleb went through the motions, coffee, emails, sanding banisters, but nothing grounded him. The memory of the knocks burrowed into his mind, a splinter he couldn't remove. He avoided the Sunday school room that day, but as dusk settled and shadows lengthened, he found himself drawn back, like the place had tethered something invisible to his spine. He uncovered the place to pick at a silent silence. The shaft yawned beneath him, unchanged, but now alive in his perception. He lowered the flashlight again, trying to find an explanation. A prank? A raccoon? A trick of echo and late-night paranoia? But what animal knocks 3 times with rhythm? He stared at the opening long enough for the darkness to feel sentient, like it was staring back. He decided he'd go down. Not tonight, but soon. He needed to know what was under this place, not just for curiosity's sake, for safety, for truth, for peace of mind. Maybe all 3. But even as he told himself he would do it logically, with backup, with preparation, some part of him knew he wouldn't wait. That night, as rain began to tap at the windows again, Caleb lay in bed, fully dressed, flashlight by his side, boots within reach. Just in case. Because part of him hoped, maybe even expected, those footsteps would return, and this time he wouldn't freeze. He'd follow them. Caleb knew waiting would only make it worse. The questions had already rooted deep in his mind, and with each hour that passed, the silence of the chapel pressed heavier on his shoulders. The plywood covering the shaft now felt like a lid on something breathing, something not content to stay buried. The morning after the second night of footsteps, Caleb poured himself a cup of coffee, left it untouched on the counter, and returned to the Sunday school room. The boards came up more easily this time, as though the structure had grown used to being exposed. Or maybe he had just stopped being afraid. With the makeshift cover cleared, he grabbed his flashlight and a crowbar, then peered again into the darkness. The spiral of stone steps he had glimpsed earlier was clearer now in the daylight, though it looked no less ancient. As he examined the shaft, Caleb noticed something wedged beneath the wooden frame. A panel of rusted metal, barely distinguishable from the surrounding stone. He pushed against it with the crowbar, and with a loud metallic groan, the panel dislodged. Dust and grit fell in a small avalanche, revealing what was unmistakably a hatch, solid iron, corroded at the hinges, but real. Its handle had long since seized with rust. Caleb worked it slowly, his grip slipping more than once before the old latch finally gave way. The hatch opened inward, scraping against the stone lip with a noise like a scream held in for decades. Beneath it, the spiral staircase descended steeply, vanishing into pitch black. For a long moment, Caleb stared down, breathing through his mouth to avoid the damp, mineral-rich scent rising from below. He wasn't prepared, not really, but preparation had become a luxury he could no longer afford. With a headlamp clipped to his flannel collar and his flashlight in hand, he stepped onto the first stone stair. The air grew colder with each step. The chapel above faded into silence, replaced by the oppressive quiet of the earth around him. The walls were rough-hewn stone, lined irregularly as though built in haste or secrecy. After about 20 feet, the staircase ended at a narrow corridor. Its walls were damp, and the ceiling arched just low enough that Caleb had to stoop slightly to pass through. He kept moving, slowly, methodically, heart pounding with each step. The tunnel curved once, then twice, before opening into a rectangular chamber. At first glance, it looked like a storage room, bare stone, dirt floor, and he froze. The country light swept across the walls, and he froze. Photos, hundreds of them, each one affixed with old yellowing tape, curling at the corners. Portraits of children, some smiling, others solemn, some blurry or poorly framed. They lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Caleb stepped closer, drawn to them like a moth to flame. The faces stared back at him with glassy eyes, trapped in their two-dimensional silence. Boys and girls of various ages, none older than 10. The photos were black and white, faded with time, no names, no dates, no context, just rows upon rows of nameless children. In the center of the room stood a small table, partially collapsed under the weight of mildew and time. Caleb approached it carefully, noting the dusty outlines of objects long removed. Paper clips, a mug, maybe a clipboard. Whatever had once sat there was gone now, but the room felt untouched, as if sealed off rather than abandoned. He turned slowly, trying to absorb it all. Why here? Why in a church basement? Who took these photos? The flashlight caught a glimmer in the corner. He turned and discovered a small, rusted filing cabinet, its drawers fused shut from years of corrosion. He tried the top one, but it wouldn't budge. The bottom drawer gave a little under force, creaking as it slid open an inch. Inside, he could barely make out what looked like laminated cards, some kind of index system maybe, but before he could reach in, a sound echoed faintly down the corridor behind him. It was soft, barely there, a shuffle, a whisper of movement against stone. Caleb turned off his light and froze, heart thudding like a drum in his throat. Darkness enveloped him instantly, thick and complete. He held his breath and listened. Nothing. Just the dripping of water somewhere deep in the tunnel system. After a minute, he turned the light back on, the beam shaking as it cut through the dark. The corridor was empty. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that someone had known he was there. He backed out of the room slowly, eyes scanning every crevice. As he returned through the corridor, he marked the turns carefully in his memory, feeling a sharp edge of panic creep into his chest. The stairs loomed ahead like a rope to the surface, and he climbed them two at a time, every nerve screaming to reach the top. When he finally pushed the hatch shut behind him, he leaned against it, sweating and cold. The chapel was silent as ever, still. But now it felt different. Now it felt complicit. The next morning, Caleb woke to the sound of wind battering the chapel windows, but it wasn't the storm that haunted him. It was the faces. Even with his eyes closed, he could still see the rows of children staring out from the underground chamber, their expressions frozen in time, stripped of identity. He couldn't stop thinking about them, who they were, what happened to them, and why their images had been sealed in darkness for decades. There were too many questions, and the silence of the chapel was starting to feel less like peace and more like complicity. That day, he didn't return to the tunnel. Instead, he walked into town, craving the noise of people, the rhythm of something normal. The local diner was nearly empty, save for the usual few, older men with newspapers, a waitress named Deanne, who always wore bright lipstick, and in the far corner, an elderly man nursing coffee so weak it looked like tea. Caleb had seen him before, always alone, always quiet. This time, though, Caleb approached. "Mind if I join you?" The old man looked up, eyes a pale, cloudy blue. "You're the one fixing up the chapel," he said, more a statement than a question. "I'm Caleb." He offered his hand. The old man took it without a smile. "Most folks call me Red, short for Redford, not my hair." Caleb smiled politely, but wasted no time. "Did you grow up around here?" "Born here, stayed. Guess I'll die here too." Red's tone was dry, almost amused. "Did you ever hear anything unusual about that chapel? About the basement?" Red's expression didn't change, but he stopped sipping his coffee. He stared at Caleb for a long second before nodding slowly. "That place used to be a cloister orphanage," he said, "back before they shut it down. Wasn't always a chapel. In the early 900s, it housed Orph Streak. Girls mostly. Run by a silent order, nuns that took vows so strict they barely spoke to each other." Caleb frowned. "And it shut down because—" Red looked out the window as if weighing whether to speak. "There was an incident in '71, he finally said. "A whole group of kids disappeared. No one really talks about it now, but I was 16 then. Still remember the sirens." "Disappeared? Like missing?" Red nodded. 6 girls. Vanished in one night. Some said they ran away. Others said it was something darker. The sisters gave no answers, and after the state got involved, the place was shuttered. Sold off a decade later. No one stayed long in it since. Folks said it was cursed, but no one called it that out loud." Caleb leaned back, the weight of the revelation pressing against his chest. "Why didn't anyone dig deeper?" Red gave a dry chuckle. "This town's got deep pockets and shallow mouths. People don't go looking for ghosts unless they're sure they won't find them." Caleb didn't eat that day. He returned to the chapel before dusk, his mind spinning with possibilities, timelines, names without faces. Back inside, the chapel felt colder than before, the wind having found its way through every crack and seam. He walked to the vestry, the smallest room at the back, a place he had used mainly for storage until now. Something about Red's story had reignited his need to look deeper. He rummaged through the cabinets, old shelves, even beneath the carpet, pulling at anything that felt loose or out of place. It was behind a false back panel in the closet that he found it, a leather-bound book covered in dust, spine cracked and nearly unreadable. When he opened it, the smell of mildew and old paper filled the air. It was a ledger of sorts, handwritten in looping cursive, faded ink trailing across yellowed pages. At first it appeared to be a log of medical appointments, vaccinations, physicals, nutrition records. But as he flipped further in, the entries began to shift in tone. Notes grew vaguer. Terms like non-resistance, emotional regression, and sensory incompatibility appeared repeatedly. Then, on a page marked August 12, 1971, an entry stood out. Subjects 4B through 9, extreme agitation when exposed to full spectrum. Recommendation: relocate to level 3 for continued observation. Note: Father R approved transfer under silence clause. Caleb stared at the words, heart pounding. Relocate to level 3. It had to mean the tunnel. He skimmed the pages around it, finding repeated mentions of special cases and controlled conditioning. No names, only designations, numbers and letters like catalog entries in a forgotten archive. At the back of the book was a folded sheet, brittle and nearly torn. It appeared to be a blueprint, or perhaps a floor plan, drawn in pencil. The chapel was at the top, marked ground access. Below it were 3 levels. The second looked like what he'd already discovered, the corridor and the photo end room. But there was a 3rd level, lower, and it was marked only with a single word: hold. Caleb ran his fingers over the page. The lines were faint, but the implications were heavy. These children weren't just cared for here, they were monitored, tested, maybe hidden. A sudden gust of wind slammed the vestry door shut behind him, making him jump. He turned, pulse racing, the old book clutched in his. Outside, the sky had darkened prematurely, clouds thick with rain or something heavier. He didn't care. He pulled on his jacket and returned to the shaft without another word. By the time Caleb emerged from the vestry, with the medical ledger and blueprint folded under his arm, dusk had settled over Hartley Ridge like a heavy veil. Rain slicked the windows, and the low hum of wind coursed through the rafters, groaning like a warning. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he spread the documents across the dining table and cross-referenced everything: photo room, stairwell dimensions, notations in the journal, until the oil in his lantern burned out and the chapel was plunged into complete darkness. He sat alone in the silence, the sound of his own heartbeat oddly loud in the old sanctuary, and whispered to himself, what were they doing down there? The answer never came. The next morning, Caleb showered and forced himself through a routine. Work kept his hands busy, if not his mind. Despite everything, the homestay was still opening soon, and he had booked his first guest, a travel blogger named Lisa from Savannah, who arrived just before sunset with a duffel bag and a too bright smile. "This place is absolutely haunting," she had said with cheerful enthusiasm. "This place is absolutely haunting," she had said with cheerfulness at 2 a.m. Caleb tried to mask his discomfort with a polite nod. Lisa didn't ask many questions about the renovations or the chapel's history. She seemed more interested in capturing aesthetic decay for her social media feed, and Caleb found her presence oddly comforting, normal even. For a few hours, it almost felt like a working business rather than a decaying monument to secrets. But that illusion shattered before sunrise. At 4:17 a.m., Caleb woke to the sound of a car engine revving. He ran to the front windows and caught only the tail end of Lisa's silver Honda disappearing down the fog-slicked road, brake lights glowing red like the eyes of something fleeing or chasing. Confused, Caleb stumbled out the front door, barefoot, the cold stone burning against his skin. On the porch railing, weighted down by a smooth river rock, was a folded sheet of paper. He opened it with trembling fingers. The message was handwritten, rushed, the letters jagged and uneven. "I'm sorry I left without saying goodbye. Something was wrong. At 2:48 a.m., I felt someone watching me. Not from the hallway, from inside the wall. I don't think it liked me being here. I could feel it through the boards. It watched me breathe. There was no signature, Caleb stood frozen in the damp morning air, the letter limp in his hand. He waited until full daylight before entering Lisa's room, not out of fear, but respect, perhaps both. The room was undisturbed, her bedsheets were crumpled, the bathroom towel still damp, and the closet door ajar. Nothing broken, nothing stolen. But there was one oddity. On the wall, behind the headboard, barely visible in the morning light, was a small crack in the paneling, thin, no wider than a finger. He stepped closer and felt a sudden chill, not from air, but from intuition. It was the kind of chill that tells you you're not alone. He covered it with a chair and stepped away. That day, he canceled all upcoming reservations. The homestay would remain closed until further notice. The next anomaly came 2 nights later. Caleb was in the chapel's loft installing curtain rods when the lights flickered. At first, he thought nothing of it. Old wiring, maybe a surge. But then, they went completely dark. Not just the loft, every room. The chapel fell silent, dead. He checked the breaker. Fine. Rebooted the generator, restored power. But at exactly 3:03 a.m., the lights died again. Every bulb, every outlet. As if the building exhaled all its energy at once. He repeated this process for 3 consecutive nights, and each time, the blackout struck precisely at 3. He brought in a local electrician named Mitch, who inspected everything from the new circuit board to the mainline conduit. "There's no reason this should be happening," Mitch had said, scratching the back of his neck. "It's not tripping breakers, it's not overloading, it's just shutting off." "Could it be on a timer?" Caleb asked, already knowing the answer. Mitch shook his head. "You'd see a controller unit somewhere." "You don't have one. This is manual, but nothing's flipping it." Caleb nodded, thanked him, and locked the chapel that night without turning on any lights. He sat in the nave, watching the time tick toward 3:00, breathing slow and quiet. When the clock hit the hour, every visible light snuffed out in synchronized silence. Even his lantern, which wasn't plugged in, flickered low for a second, then steadied. The darkness wasn't just visual, it was emotional. A silence so total it pressed against his chest like weight. That night, he dreamt of children again, standing shoulder to shoulder in that room beneath the chapel. No sound, no speech, just rows of faces lit by flickering, unseen light. One of them, a girl with short bangs and hollow eyes, slowly raised her hand and pointed. In the dream, Caleb turned to follow the gesture and saw himself standing in the corner, older and confused, holding a key he didn't remember finding. When he woke, his hands were cold and his boots were already on. The next morning, Caleb didn't bother with coffee or breakfast. The air in the chapel felt stifling, like something was waiting, coiled just beneath the surface. He knew he had to go back down. The journal entries, the photo room, the blackout at exactly 3:00 a.m., none of it was random. Something beneath this chapel was unfinished, demanding to be acknowledged. With a crowbar in one hand and a lantern in the other, Caleb returned to the shaft and descended the spiral stairs again, this time deeper, his resolve firmer, his fear now a quiet companion instead of a master. The second level was just as he left it, silent, oppressive, and filled with the gazes of forgotten children. But this time, he didn't stop there. He used the old blueprint as a guide, following a corridor that appeared solid at first until he noticed a seam in the stone, a rectangular outline too precise to be natural. Dusting the edges, he found hinges buried beneath layers of grime. It wasn't a wall, it was a door. He wedged the car bar into the crack and pulled. The stone groaned in protest before shifting, revealing a narrow passage behind it that sloped downward. The air grew colder with every step he took, heavy with mold and something metallic like rusted iron and old blood. At the bottom was a chamber smaller than the one with the photographs, but darker, the stone walls lined with deteriorated insulation panels. In one corner, on top of a rusted cart, sat a dusty black case. A small sticker on the latch read, "Property of HHS, Restricted Access, 1973. His pulse quickened. He opened the case. Inside were several reels of film stored in plastic canisters labeled with dates and numerical codes. Some were broken, others intact. Next to them was an old 16mm projector, its power cord severed but otherwise functional. Caleb carried it all back upstairs, nearly stumbling from the weight. In the loft, using an old generator and a voltage adapter he had lying around, he managed to splice together a power source. It took him 3 hours to get the projector working. When he finally loaded the first reel and turned it on, the machine sputtered to life, and light flickered across the opposite wall. The image was grainy and unsteady, but it showed a white room, sterile and windowless. A child sat on a metal chair, hands on knees, eyes unfocused. A man in a lab coat stood beside her, holding a clipboard. "Patient 9C," the man said in a flat voice, "refuses light exposure. Subject exhibits signs of advanced psychological dissociation when isolated." The image crackled, farewell shifted. The same girl, hours later, was now facing a bright lamp. Her expression changed, twitched, before she began to scream silently, mouth wide, body frozen. No audio, just flickering light and her agony. Caleb's stomach turned. The next reel was worse. A boy, maybe 7, tied at the wrists, his eyes tracking a moving object off-screen while a group of adults took notes. The word compliance was scrawled in the margin of one frame. The final film was dated September 3, 1971, just days after the supposed disappearances. It showed a group of children in a circle, hand in hand, eyes vacant. One by one, they were led out of frame. The final image was the empty room. No voices, no conclusions, just silence. Caleb switched off the projector and sat in the dark, the only sound the dark prayer for silence kept by them. It wasn't just therapy, it wasn't care, it was experimentation. Institutionalized, hidden beneath religious cover, children had been subjected to something clinical, detached, and inhumane. That night, unable to sleep, Caleb returned to the room of photographs and examined them again, with fresh eyes. He took digital snapshots of each one, uploading them to an anonymous online forum for missing persons cases. It was a long shot, but he needed to try. 2 days later, he received a message. The reply came from a woman named Grace Randall, a retired private investigator in Alabama who had worked on cold cases from the 1970s. She wrote, "Photo 47, girl with the ribbon in her braid. Matches composite sketch from a case I followed for 15 years. Name, Abigail Mercer. Missing from Monroe County in July 1971. Case never solved. Parents long deceased. No record she was ever adopted." Caleb read the message 3 times, his hands shaking. He printed the image and placed it beside the ledger entry for Subject 7A. The timeline matched, location close enough, and suddenly this wasn't just a horror beneath his floor, it was a forgotten crime scene spanning state lines. That night, he went down again, past the photo room, past the sealed corridor, all the way to the 3rd level marked on the blueprint. Clear. Caleb emerged from the 3rd level drenched in sweat and dust, his lungs aching from the stale air and his legs sore from the climb. The descent into the whole level had not gone as expected. It was more than a basement. It was a vault, a sealed grid of rooms, some collapsed, others disturbingly intact. He hadn't been able to open more than 2 of the doors, and what lay behind them was still clawing at the edge of his memory, like a nightmare not ready to be remembered. The images down there, the restraints, the dark stains on the concrete, the single rusted cot bolted to the floor, they echoed in his mind long after he sealed the hatch again and covered it with furniture. He didn't leave the chapel that day. He barely moved. He drank water, sat in silence, and tried to write down what he had seen, but his hands trembled too badly to hold a pen. At some point, he forced himself to go into the living room to grab a book, anything to distract himself, when he noticed something out of place. The bookshelf. He'd rearranged it just last week, stacking old hymnals by size and color, but one of the spines was misaligned, sticking out slightly. He stepped closer and ran his hand along the edge, and that's when he saw it. A tiny, dark dot just inside the crease between the shelf and the wall. A small lens, round, cold, locked, disguised within the bookshelf frame, barely visible to the naked eye. It wasn't part of the security system he'd installed. It wasn't connected to anything he could trace. Someone had placed it there. Recently. He carefully unscrewed the panel and removed the camera, examining the tiny circuitry. There was no storage. It had to be transmitting live. Somewhere, someone was watching. He scanned the room again, paranoia bleeding like mold inside his chest. How long had it been there? Since before Lisa? Since he moved in? That night, he ripped through the rest of the chapel, inspecting every room, every crevice. He found another camera in the hallway near the back door, this one mounted behind a loose beam, its cable threaded into the wall. He cut it, pocketed the lens, and stood in the dark, heart thudding. Someone had been monitoring him. Not ghosts, not memories, someone alive. When he finally collapsed into bed at dawn, sleep did not come. Instead, there was a knock on the door. Caleb froze. 3 soft, deliberate raps. He stood, reached for the crowbar he now kept beside the bed, and crept toward the front. No car outside, no footsteps in the gravel, just the wind. He opened the door slowly and saw no one, only a plain manila envelope lying on the doormat. He picked it up and stepped back inside before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typewritten, unsigned. The message read, "Stop digging. You don't want what's buried here. There's a reason the state left it alone." Caleb read it 3 times, each line pressing into him with new weight. The warning wasn't dramatic. It was factual, stern, as if written by someone who had already seen too much and expected he would understand. It didn't say, "Leave," it said, "Stop." And that distinction chilled him more than any ghost. Someone knew what he was doing. Worse, they knew where he lived, what room he slept in, which wall to hide a camera in. He carried the letter upstairs and compared the typeface to the government records he'd copied from the HHS film reels. It matched. Not conclusively, but enough to make his stomach turn. For the next 2 days, Caleb stayed off the grid. He unplugged his router, removed all electronics except an old radio, and began combing through every square inch of the chapel again, this time looking for traces not of spirits, but surveillance. He found nothing else, but the damage was done. The house didn't feel like his anymore. It felt infiltrated. Then the dreams started again. This time they were more vivid. Not just the children in the photo room, but corridors he hadn't walked, doors he hadn't opened. One recurring image haunted him, a clipboard on a table, name scratched out violently, the only word left intact, "Oh, serve." In the dream, he always reached for it, but just before touching the clipboard, the lights would blow out, and he'd wake up in a cold sweat. On the 3rd night, he heard footsteps again, not below, but above, the attic. He climbed the stairs, crowbar in hand, and stood at the top of the landing, listening. Silence. Then a soft scuffle, like paper sliding across wood. He threw open the attic door and shone his light around. Nothing. Dust, boxes, insulation. But near the far wall, resting against the base of an old chimney stack, was another envelope, this one marked with a single red dot. He opened it slowly, hands shaking. Inside were photographs, grainy, black and white, clearly taken from security footage. One showed Caleb descending the staircase into the first tunnel. Another showed him sleeping at the table with the projector reels. The final image was of his front door, taken from outside, time-stamped at 2:46 a.m. just 4 nights ago. He stared at them, disbelief curdling into nausea. They weren't old, they were current, recent. Whoever sent them had access to his property, his home, and his life. He stumbled back, clutching the envelope to his chest, and whispered the only thing that came to mind. "They're still here." Caleb didn't leave the chapel for days. The photographs in the attic had pushed him past paranoia into a state of cold, methodical focus. There was no longer room for doubt or second-guessing. Whoever had been watching him wasn't just aware, they were involved. They were part of the history buried in these walls, and possibly still operating under its shadow. He didn't bother contacting police. His trust in surface-level authority had eroded with every discovery. Instead, he returned to the 3rd level, the hole armed with floodlights, gloves, and 2 days' worth of supplies. If this place had something left to reveal, he would tear the ground apart to find it. The lower tunnels were more claustrophobic than he remembered, each turn growing tighter, the walls damp with age and neglect. Following the blueprint again, he searched for any sign of the chamber marked simply with an X, a space without label, measurement, or notation. It took 4 hours of crawling, dust clearing, and flashlight scanning before he found it. A section of wall where the stone pattern shifted subtly, as though a door had once existed there, bricked over hastily. He tapped it. The hollow thud confirmed his suspicion. He used the crowbar to chip away at the mortar, each strike echoing down the tunnel like distant cannon fire. After an hour, a piece broke loose, revealing a void behind it, black, stagnant, and deeper than any of the other chambers. He widened the hole and slid through, boots scraping stone as he entered. His floodlight flicked on and revealed the truth. The room was larger than the others, and colder, not in temperature, but in purpose. The walls were lined with iron bars, forming a single oversized cage bolted into the stone. Inside were shackles, some hanging from the top beams, others mounted to the ground. Rusted links clattered softly as he stepped closer. The metal was stained in spots, brown, reddish, dried into the pores of the floor. One corner had what looked like scratch marks, thin and erratic. Caleb's breath caught as he realized the space wasn't a room. It was a cell. A containment chamber, built not for protection, but for imprisonment. Not far from the cage, half buried in rubble, he spotted a box, the edges visible beneath a mound of loose cement. He dug it out with bare hands, coughing on the dust, until he freed the container. It was wooden, warped, and sealed with old nails. He pried it open and found inside a single 8-amp film reel, encased in wax paper and labeled in faded pencil. Property of Altria, Session 14B, for review only. Beneath it was a sealed envelope containing a typed sheet. The letterhead bore no governmental insignia, only the name of an entity he had never encountered before, Altria Human Studies Initiative. The letter read, "Do not circulate. Subjects exhibiting level C sensory detachment require complete isolation and psychological fragmentation to permit external emotional calibration. Continued cohabitation protocols are no longer viable. Session 14B terminated due to threshold breach." Caleb didn't know what any of it meant, but every word felt engineered to hide something horrifying behind sterile language. That night, back in the loft, he spliced the reel into the projector. The film was grainy but watchable. It opened with a man in a beige suit speaking directly into the camera. "This is Session 14B, conducted under proxy support from the Altria Human Studies Initiative in cooperation with regional wellness affiliates. All activities fall under observational exemption due to non-government metering." The camera panned to a glass room. Inside it, a child, maybe 8, small, thin, sitting on a cot with arms wrapped tightly around their knees. The voice continued. "Subject 9A continues to exhibit rejection of auditory stimulus. No response to parental tone mimicry, no change under light exposure. Commencing Phase 2, static isolation." The scene shifted. The child was now standing in a small, white room, a mirror wall reflecting their posture. An unseen voice said softly, "Can you hear me?" The child didn't react. Seconds passed. The lights dimmed. Then a loud mechanical hum began, and the child flinched violently, collapsing to the floor. The image cut to black. The next clip showed 2 men in suits reviewing papers, one saying, "The dosage might need recalibration, or we simply let the silent ones fade. We can't afford outliers if they're going to fracture group metrics." The last frame was a static shot of the same child, now lying motionless. The tape ended. Caleb stared at the blank wall, bile rising in his throat. These weren't treatments. They were conditioning, experiments disguised as therapy. The outliers were children deemed too sensitive, too unresponsive, too hard to mold. So they were erased, hidden, broken. Or worse. He returned to the cage chamber and photographed everything, every angle, every stain, every bolt and shackle. The floor creaked beneath his feet as he knelt near the base of the cage, brushing aside the last of the cement fragments. And that's when he saw it, another envelope. Water damaged but sealed. Inside was a list, a typewritten roster of children, their designated codes beside their birth names, most crossed out with a thick black line, but one name remained uncensored. At the bottom, beneath all the erasures, it read, "Eleanor Whitlock. Subject 3C, C assigned." That name, Whitlock. The woman who always asked about the renovations. She had told him her name weeks ago, and he hadn't thought twice. But now, He couldn't stop thinking. Caleb didn't sleep the night he found Eleanor Whitlock's name on the reassignment list. The implications rattled every nerve in his body. If she had once been part of the program, if she was a surviving subject, then that meant not all the children had vanished into the abyss beneath the chapel. Some had emerged, some had lived, and some, perhaps, had forgotten. Or worse, remembered everything and stayed silent. The next morning, Caleb left the chapel and drove into town with a manila envelope full of photographs, printouts from the reels, and the list he had found beneath the cage. His first stop was the local paper, a modest two-room office above a bakery where the scent of flour and yeast lingered like nostalgia. He asked for the only reporter he had ever seen in the bylines, Marlene Nix. She was in her late 40s, with a sharp voice and sharper eyes, and when Caleb spread the contents of the envelope on her desk, her cynicism slowly gave way to concern. "I've heard whispers about that place," she said, pointing to one of the blurry photographs from the cell. "But no one's ever brought proof like this." Caleb explained everything, from the initial renovations to the tunnels and the government reels, down to the name he'd discovered, Eleanor Whitlock. Marlene took a long breath and opened a locked cabinet behind her desk. From it, she pulled a cardboard box labeled Cold Case Leads 1965198. Over the next few hours, she and Caleb cross-referenced the images of the children from the underground photo room, with old missing person flyers and scanned microfilm clippings from county records. It was exhausting work, but eventually they matched 6 of the photographs. 6 children who had disappeared between 1969 and 1972, all from surrounding counties. None of the cases had been solved. In each one, the families had reported that their children had been referred to free mental wellness retreats, often sponsored by traveling ministries or charitable medical vans that coordinated with churches. The paper trails led back to one name, the Sanctified Path, a now defunct religious nonprofit that had once operated out of the very chapel Caleb had purchased. According to archived articles, the Sanctified Path claimed to offer spiritual cleansing and emotional renewal for troubled youth, with all services fully funded by anonymous benefactors. The record stopped abruptly in 1973. When Caleb dug deeper, he found that the Sanctified Path's charitable status had been revoked due to non-compliance with state licensing for care of minors, but no criminal charges had been filed. The deeper he and Marlene looked, the more walls they hit. Files sealed, clerks deflecting, names missing from databases. That night, Marlene called in a favor from an old contact, a retired social worker named Evelyn Caro, who had once coordinated placements for at-risk youth in the Tri-Country area during the early 70s. She hadn't spoken publicly about her work in decades, but when Marlene mentioned the chapel and the name Altria, Evelyn agreed to meet. They convened at a quiet diner off Route 17, where Evelyn, now frail but alert, sipped tea slowly and listened without interruption, sat in amicable setting where Caleb laid out what he had discovered. When he finished, she sat in silence for a long while before speaking. "We called it the Divine Light Project back then," she said. "At least that's what the paperwork said. They brought us kids they claimed were disruptive, emotionally volatile, said they needed special attention, spiritual attention. But I didn't buy it. Some of these kids were just quiet or different, sensitive to light or sound. Some had trouble sitting still in class. Others refused to speak at all. And they were all poor, easy to disappear." Eva only shook her head. "I don't know. We were just told to refer families to the program. Everything looked legitimate, federal funding, religious backing. But no one ever returned, and when I started asking too many questions, they shut down my department, told me it was being consolidated." She pulled a faded ID badge from her purse and handed it to Caleb. On the back was an address in Maryland, a building now abandoned. "That's where the files were kept. If there's anything left, it'll be there. But be careful. These people, they didn't stop because they got caught. They stopped because they moved." When Caleb returned to the chapel that night, his hands shook with the weight of truth. The Sanctified Path, the Altria Initiative, the Divine Light Project, they were all the same machine wearing different masks. A mechanism designed to erase the inconvenient, the non-compliant, the sensitive, under the guise of spiritual healing. He stared again at the photographs of the children, now with names, now with stories, and realized the chapel wasn't just a place of hiding, it was a funnel, a one-way door. Until now. The following week passed in a whirlwind of quiet revelations and increasingly loud consequences. After gathering every document, photograph, and recording, Caleb and Marlene compiled a comprehensive report, a digital dossier filled with time-stamped evidence, witness accounts, archived news articles, and the corroborated names of missing children. With Evelyn Caro's affidavit and the support of a retired federal clerk who still had partial access to the Department of Health's discommissioned archives, they reached out to the only authority with enough reach and resources to act, the FBI's Crimes Against Children Division. The response was not immediate, but it was definitive. 2 agents arrived within days, followed by a forensic archaeology team and a mobile lab. They cordoned off the chapel like a crime scene and began their descent into the tunnels Caleb had walked alone. What followed was a slow, grim unearthing of decades of silence. Inside the third-level chamber, investigators found personal items hidden in the walls and floor. Buttons, broken eyeglasses, a child's cloth bracelet with faded embroidery, the initials EMM stitched in pink thread. DNA analysis began almost immediately, with samples cross-corrected against federal and state databases for missing persons. News of the investigation broke regionally, then nationally, and soon families from as far as Arkansas and Tennessee were reaching out, submitting saliva kits, sending old photographs, begging to know if their long-lost children had ever set foot inside that chapel. Within 2 months, 6 matches were confirmed. 6 families received long-lost answers, not the ones they had prayed for, but answers nonetheless. Closure came with the grief of knowing the truth had been hidden just beneath their feet all this time. Caleb was contacted by each family. Some came in person, standing in the photo room in tears, pointing to the image of a face they'd last seen in the 1970s. Others sent letters, thanking him for doing what no one else had dared. The chapel, once a hollow shell of false faith and buried torment, now stood as evidence. It was declared a protected federal site, pending demolition or conversion to a memorial, a decision still under legal review. For Caleb, the investigation brought no peace, only an odd stillness. It remained at the property for weeks after the FBI left, cleaning what he could, sealing the entrance to the tunnels, and installing a memorial wall in the main room, a quiet display of the names confirmed, the photos that had faces now, and the ones that still remained unknown. A local artist donated a stained glass window depicting 6 faceless silhouettes walking into light. On a brisk October morning, Marlene returned to the chapel with a printed newspaper clipping in hand. "They're running the story nationally next week," she said. "They're calling it the Hartley Ridge Silence Project." Caleb smiled faintly. "Too clean a name for something so filthy," he replied. That afternoon he received an unmarked envelope in the chapel's mailbox. No return address, no stamps, just a smooth white envelope sealed with a single piece of clear tape. He opened it slowly, expecting another letter of gratitude or perhaps a legal notice. Inside was a single black and white photograph. At first glance it seemed innocuous, a wide-angle shot of the chapel taken from across the field. The overcast sky loomed in the background, and the windows glinted faintly with the reflection of light. In the top right corner of the chapel, at the second-story window, the loft where he had first projected the film reels, stood a figure. A small one, a child, barely visible, face pressed against the glass, staring directly into the lens. Caleb's chest tightened. He flicked the photo over. No writing, no markings, just the silent question that pressed deeper than anything else. When was this taken? He went upstairs immediately, opened the loft window, and looked out at the same angle. The glass was smudged but intact. The floor beneath was dusty and undisturbed. No footprints, no signs of recent movement. He checked the security footage but found nothing. The system had reset itself 2 nights ago after a lightning storm, and the archive was corrupted. There were no other copies. The FBI had taken most of the evidence. He stood there for a long time, staring out the window, photo still in hand, unsure whether the figure had been real or a reflection. Perhaps it was an old image printed recently, designed to saddle, or perhaps it was a final reminder that not all children had been accounted for, that some silences were deeper than others, that the past, no matter how thoroughly excavated, still lived in the seams of stone and glass and memory. That night, Caleb lit 6 candles along the memorial wall, one for each child identified, and one more left unlit for whoever still watched from the shadows. The chapel was quiet again, but this time it wasn't empty. It remembered. If this story gripped you as much as it did us, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more chilling mysteries rooted in forgotten truths. What part of the story shook you the most, and where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We read every one.